Hi, everyone. I would like to begin with expressing my deepest gratitude to the Race Before Race board for inviting me to share my work at the symposium today, especially the directors of the Shakespeare Center in London, Farah Karim Cooper and Jemima Matthews, and the ACMRS directors, Ayana Thompson and Ruben Espinoza. And of course, I would like to also thank you, Terry. I would also like to thank Terry Kessler and Leah Newsom for dealing with the logistics and making sure we get here and are comfortable. Thank you. I will begin now. My grandmother was a great storyteller, and I had the habit of recording her whenever she started telling me one of her stories. Naturally, all my voice recordings catch her mid-sentence, already having begun. Early last year, I was listening to one of them, which begins with her saying, "She hasn't come by lately. I don't know what's wrong. This girl, my love." I immediately assume she's complaining about my youngest aunt, Batul, not coming to see her. But I was a little confused because this aunt comes to see her almost every other day. She continues, "I had a dream. I don't know what I was going through, so I said to al-Banin, 'Come, I want you for a bit.'" I realized suddenly that the girl she's talking about is not my aunt. It's Imam Ali's second wife from the 7th century. She continues, "Next thing I know, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad, she had come. She was wearing loose pants and a short dress, till here. Her head was wrapped in a kerchief. She was holding a small baby to her chest. She didn't say anything, just stood next to me for a while and then left. Since then, none of them have come. I always say to them, 'Come, I want you for a bit.'" The audio recording continues, but distracted, I laugh at how disoriented I am. And I realize suddenly just how present figures like the Prophet, his family, and God were in my grandmother's life. My work attempts to explore and understand the nature of this presence in the works and lives of pious Shīʿī Muslims. I turn to the devotional genre of supplications, du'a, as instances where these immaterial, more than human figures are spoken to, loved, visited, cried for, and asked for help, and lived with. In my talk today, I focus specifically on the relationship between the pious and the sacred in terms of language and the politics of language, exploring old and new conversation about who is deemed better fit and more prepared for these relations with the divine. I trace historical conceptions of Arab supremacy in relation to the revelation, and then explore how they seep into conversations on what language is deemed better for non-Arabs to use in their conversations with the divine. My talk today begins with looking at a 9th century text titled The Excellence of the Arabs by Ibn Qutaybah, where I trace some early constructed associations between revelation, Islam, and race, Arabness, and its resultant hierarchization of groups of people based on their imagined closeness or distance from revelation. I then think about how such rhetoric about the privilege and preeminence of Arabs seeps into the current moment and translates into racist rhetoric that constructs ideas of religious belonging and superiority through ideas of language belonging and language ownership. In looking at language as a tool of racialization, I then move on to look at how some recent rhetoric that recreates these old racial discourses on who owns and should use what language in non-obligatory prayer, like supplication recitations, which is deeply linguistic in nature. I ask, what kind of harm does critiquing non-Arab communities for holding onto Arabic supplications do? What kinds of love between the supplicant and the supplication, between the supplicant and the very language and words of the Prophet and the Imam, as the original reciters of the supplications, do such critiques miss when they focus a little too much on language as a mode of cognition and meaning transfer? Borrowing the symposium's theme of rising, I sit with my Persian supplicating grandmother's love and attachment to the medieval Arabic physical words of her Prophet and the Imams, and to see if it can allow us to rise above the racialization of language. In his text, The Excellence of the Arabs, Ibn Qutaybah, a scholar and state-appointed judge in Abbasid Baghdad, attempts to present arguments for the superiority and the preeminence of the Arabs, among others. The text is clearly reactionary, responding to presumed attacks on and shifts in the conceptions of Arabness during a politically unstable period of early Islam. The scholar of classical Arabic literature, James Montgomery, traces the shifts in conceptions of Arabness. He notes that in the 2 or 3 generations after the advent of Islam, Muslim conquerors attempted to differentiate themselves from their subject populations by creating a new sense of belonging to an Arab community that associated Arabs' identity to this elite conqueror status. Also, given how few of the conquered peoples in the first century Islam converted, Islam was also being associated to being an Arab faith. The 8th century also witnessed a group of specialists of Arabic poetry, genealogy, history, who participated in formulating a sense of the pre-Islamic Arab identity. Ibn Qutayba's 9th century Baghdad witnessed increased cosmopolitanism, immigration, the mixing of population, the expansion of the capital, the fall of Arab political factions, and the disintegration of the caliphate into more regional blocs. It was also a period during which there was higher Turkic and Persian presence among the Abbasid military elites. Ibn Qutayba seems to be writing his defense of the ultimate Arab profile against groups like the Shu'ubis, who were Abbasid insiders who belittled the significance of the Arabs. As you parse through the text, you quickly notice Ibn Qutayba's defensive tone. He seems particularly irked by the Persians, and many of his arguments ultimately engage in presenting proofs for why Arabs are of a superior status when compared to the Persians. The proofs dab into arguments in each group's capacity to trace their genealogy back to the nobility or different prophets like Isaac, Ismail, Abraham, and Noah, as well as arguments on power and a comparison of the extent of either group's sovereignty, as well as arguments on the Arab relationship to the divine. This mixing of worldly and sacred genealogy, religion, processes, and manifestations of power becomes examples of what Geraldine Heng notes are, quote, key medieval instrumentalizations in the ordering of human relations, end quote. Thinking through the hierarchies that Ibn Qutayba tries to establish between Arabs and Persians presents an example of this unsystematized race-making. The excellence of the Arab constructs notions of Arab superiority that depends fairly heavily on associating Islam with Arabs and Arabness. He writes, God subsequently brought Islam, and from the Arabs elevated the Prophet, God bless and cherish him, chief of all prophets, seal of all the messengers, abrogator of all earlier revealed laws, and the most virtuous of men. God caused the Arabs to multiply, put an end to dissension among them, supported them with his angels, and strengthened them with his power. He established them in the lands and enabled them to tread upon other nations' necks. It was then, when there were no Easterners, Ajam, present, that God addressed the Arabs, saying, "You are indeed the best community that has ever been brought forth to mankind. To them belongs the excellence to which he refers. Other communities acquire excellence after the Arabs." God here is the professed agent of these hierarchies. He chooses the Arabs, he causes, gives, makes them tread upon the necks of other nations. We see an enmeshment of religion and political power in the construction of racial hierarchies. I want to focus on this language of abrogation that Ibn Qutayba uses repeatedly in his ordering of people. What he introduces here is this normative meaning to discuss how Islam, as the later religion, abrogates earlier monotheistic religions. This concept of abrogation, naskh in Arabic, is also used in Quranic interpretation and law to solve the challenge of contradictions between different verses in the Quran. Abrogation therefore means that temporally later verses in the Quran itself can reverse or modify rulings provided by earlier verses. This happens in the variant Quranic verses that expresses the different levels of permissibility of alcohol, for example. Ibn Qutayba interestingly applies this image of revelatory abrogation onto the racial hierarchies his text constructs. Speaking to how the Persians lost their power after the Muslim conquest, he writes, "No one has ever claimed that Arabs could approach the sovereign majesty, tributes, equipment, weapons, silk, and fine stuffs of the Persian realm. The Persians did possess all of these, but then God gave them to the Arabs, who plundered the Persians, stripping them of their riches like bark from a tree. Just as revelation that overrides an earlier one is better, so too it's with people." The actual final line of this quote in Arabic reads, وَالنَّاسِخُ أَفْضَلُ مِنَ الْمَنْسُوخِ, simply translating as the abrogating is better than the abrogated, dropping all words of similitude between revelation and peoples. The Arabs abrogate the Persians. He repeats this use of the concept of abrogation in Revelation again when he describes the shifts in political power. Furthermore, he says, the Arabs and the Persians are comparable insofar as both of them ruled over kingdoms, but here too the Arabs are superior because of the basis of their sovereignty is prophethood, whereas the Persians based theirs on plunder and force. Moreover, the Arabs are superior because their sovereignty abrogated that of Persia and will endure until the day of judgment, whereas Persian sovereignty has already been supplanted. In Ibn Qutayba's rhetoric, whole peoples are abrogated like texts of revelation are. He talks about the Arabs like they are Islam and the Quran itself. The Arab rule will endure until the day of judgment, just like the Quran is thought to be the final revelation until the day of judgment. And so here is the revelation itself that abrogates the sovereignty of Persia. The same rhetoric used in these medieval images of the excellence of the Arab, albeit with different socio-historical conditions, extends into the popular rhetoric in the present moment on the performance of Arabic language rituals by non-Arabs. I will show next a short TikTok video made by an Egyptian diaspora kid living somewhere in the West. I'm guessing either in the UK or the US. In this video, he pretends to be attending a prayer service in a South Asian-run mosque and layers his act with an audio of indecipherable Arabic-sounding sounds, mocking South Asians' accents when they recite Salah in Arabic. This caption on the caption on his original video was, "Arab sheikhs just sound so angelic." The video is pretty short, it's like 5 seconds. There's sound. Let me try again. Should I click on something for sound? Sorry. Yeah. It's like a 5-second video, so. Like my friend said, you don't need much time to be racist. Should I try it?
You really thought. You really thought this was funny.
Okay. So the supposed joke here is that when South Asian Muslims, for whom Arabic is not their native language, recite prayers in Arabic, their accent is so deep that an Arab who knows these prayers by heart apparently cannot make out what they are saying. The prayer suddenly becomes indecipherable. The guy's account has been since deactivated, but his video was spread by various South Asians and some Arab TikTokers who stitched the video with their own commentary on the skit, highlighting widespread Arab racism against non-Arabic speaking Muslims' ritual practices. The joke therefore holds onto the idea that an accented recitation of Arabic prayer somehow places the non-Arabic speaking group always a step away from Islam than a native Arab speaker. The rhetoric on the politics of language and linguistic closeness to the divine also appears in recent discussions on pious reading practices like du'a recitations. Du'a is an act of worship in which a person speaks to God, either through reading an existing script or by improvising. It is a non-obligatory act of worship in Islam, in contrast to Salah, for example, which is the obligatory 5 daily prayers. It is practiced both privately and in congregations. While there is wide consensus across sects that Salah, or the 5 obligatory prayers of the day, can only be recited in Arabic, things are more lenient when we move to a genre like Du'a, which even when systematized by the supplication manuals, remains to be a more conversational and participatory genre, especially when recited collectively. It is open to being personalized as it seeps into and becomes part of everyday speech and living, which makes the movement between Arabic and native languages much easier. It is useful to note that while I will be mostly discussing more systematized du'a or supplications as a ritual, that the du'a genre actually permeates everyday speech of many Muslims. Anyone learning Arabic, for example, will quickly notice how invocations are integral parts of daily communications, no matter how pious the speaker is. After spending some time practicing his Arabic and doing ethnography in Cairo, anthropologist Samuel A. Shielke writes, "So much communication between humans has God as a third party." You can see here in this single WhatsApp screenshot just how often invocations are used as the very mode of communication. In this group chat, the members are just merely texting about someone traveling soon, and God appears 6 times. Okay. When the practice of du'a, of speaking to God outside the confines of obligatory prayer, is a type of worship prevalent in all sects of Islam, it is especially ritualized and systematized by Imami Shi'ism, where the du'as are less improvisational in nature and have historically been collected and systematized in manuals dating back to the 11th century. Most of the du'as in the Imami Shi'i tradition are presumed to be authored by either the Prophet or the Imams from his family, who lived across the 7th to 9th centuries. As we see in this example, many supplications are preceded with information about the Imam who recited the specific du'a, sometimes also explaining when and for what reasons. I can't see the screen, so I'm like, is it the right slide? But yeah, as you see in this one, like it's the parts highlighted is like the paratext to the actual supplication, and it's just introducing the imam who is presumed to have like recited this supplication, and the white stuff is the supplication itself. So another example is one of the most widely recited supplications called Du'a Kumail. It's a du'a that is attributed to the first Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib, who is said to have recited the supplication in a mosque in Basra. One of the Imam's companions, Kumail ibn Ziyad, records it, and so the supplication takes after his name. One of the most widespread Imami supplication manuals today is actually a Persian one titled Mafatih al-Jinan, or the Keys to Paradise, collected by the scholar Abbas al-Ghammi in the 20th century. It has been translated to multiple languages, including to Arabic. It is important to note that this Persian manual, as well as earlier ones like it, are multilingual, meaning that the du'a scripts are kept in their Arabic form, while the paratextual information surrounding the du'a is in Persian. In a recent edited Arabic translation of the Persian Mafatih al-Jinan, the rhetoric of language ownership seeps into understandings of du'a ownership too. In his introduction to this edited translation, the translator has a short subsection titled Returning the Book to its Original Language. The translator Al-Najafi writes, "This book has been welcomed like no other book by the speakers of the Persian language, the language that this book was put into. Tens of editions have been printed during just a few years. You will not find a pious home in which the Quran is recited that does not also have a copy or more of this great book. The Arabic language, the original language of the material that this book holds, still needs a great book like this. It was necessary to translate this book into Arabic, or in fact to return it to the Arabic text of the reports and sayings that the great composer selected and translated into Persian." Keep in mind that the translator here is not referring to the actual supplication scripts themselves, which are in fact retained in Arabic, even in the Persian Mafatih. This language of returning the Persian to the original or authentic versions assumes the borrowed state of the Persian version, which automatically becomes less genuine, authentic, real. This rhetoric on language politics again pops up in discussions by Persian speakers around what are the best ways for speaking to the divine. In her book on woman, prayer, and poetry in Iran, anthropologist Nilofar Hawari traces a shift in du'a books that are published in Iran in the decades after the Islamic Revolution. She highlights that the young, educated, middle class prefer du'a books that are entirely in Persian, noting that these books emphasize fluent and contemporary language, in contrast to the usually overly Arabized religious books in Iran. She also highlights how this younger educated generation also contrasts their mode of religiosity with their parents' religiosity. The younger educated generation describes the older generation as less critical in matters of religion and ritual, less questioning, less concerned with what this younger generation calls the presence of the heart during prayer, and that this older generation merely performed prayer in terms of duty or taklif. Ha'ari highlights that both the new Persian language dua books, with their focus on fluency, and the younger generations, with their emphasis on self-reflection and critique, share a similar concern and question. She writes, interestingly, the preference for Persian comes out most strongly in relation to these Arabic dua, claimed to have been written by the Imams. If one is to talk to God from the heart and say what one desires, why use other people's words, even if they are the Imams? And why in Arabic? This line of questioning left me quite bothered. I want to proceed my explanation, to proceed explaining my discomfort by clarifying that I'm of course not arguing against dua in Persian. The more dua in languages, the better. But what I was bothered by, however, is the fact that it felt like a direct attack against my own Persian grandmother, who loved, listened to recited Arabic and Imam-authored du'as all the time. Why use especially the Imam's Arabic words? Because of how much she loved the Imams, and in loving them, she also loved their words. While my grandmother knew some colloquial Arabic, she didn't know enough to truly understand most of the classical Arabic du'as. In a recent creative translation project of Du'a Kamel, I layer a translated script of the Arabic supplication, here in black, with a translation of YouTube recordings by two different Iranian reciters reciting the same dua to a congregation in red, as well as adding a translation of an audio recording I had of my grandmother listening to the same dua, here in blue. The sections by the Iranian reciters show their engagements with the dua, their various repetitions, their off-script Persian storytelling, like when they bring in the Prophet's family and scenes from early Islamic history into the body of the dua, their emotions and bodily movements. And the sections on my grandmother show her reciting the parts that she had memorized alongside the reciter on TV. She often skips over words, mispronounces others, sometimes says the wrong words entirely. She tries to guess where the recitation is taking place that she's watching on TV. She talks to one of the Imams and to one of the Imam's wives while listening to the recitation. She even gets distracted, like when she answers a phone call from my aunt, or at some point when she asks me if I'm cold and want a blanket. Her interjections are in a mix of her native Southern Persian as well as colloquial Arabic. According to Ha'ari's younger interlocutors, my grandmother is probably not doing the dua right, be it because of her Arabic not being good enough to properly comprehend the contents of the dua, or because her model of attention itself doesn't fit into their heavily cognitive understanding of the presence of the heart during worship. Ha'ari theorizes on the relationship between the reader to texts, especially prayers and poetry, to think about language in terms of voice and materiality, instead of merely through models of meaning and cognition. When people recite poems and prayers they love, it is not a disembodied voice that they hear, Ha'ari writes. It is not just the sound image and the concept that defines the linguistic sign, but the fact that people, memories, sounds, and events are often carried in language. Focusing on this example of pious attachment to Arabic, I similarly highlight that for certain supplicants, the physical Arabic words of these medieval beloved persons serve as a site and location of closeness with beloved figures in Islam. In conclusion, I return to the interlocutor's questions about why speak to God in the words of an other, and why in Arabic itself another other. Questions like these, when aimed solely for the reason of critique, can become a disservice to certain pious communities. However, these questions can also help us ruminate on the sorts of loving relationships these communities have to scripts and words in a language and time that is not theirs. And so, to answer the question on why talk to God in Arabic, I'd simply say, why not? Thank you.
There is some time for questions.
Yeah.
Good morning. I'm a French professor, but I've been learning Persian for 6 years. And this was really, really rich and interesting. And there's a lot I'd like to ask you about. But one thing that comes to mind is the tutors that I've been working with, who are based here, of course, have pointed out that among the younger generation, and really within Iranian society in general, there is a linguistic split, as they describe it, between people who perceive themselves as more modern, less in tune with the government, and people who are more in tune with the government. And the people who are more in tune with the government, let's say more conservative, more religious, will use Arabic much more just in their daily speech. And so to bring it back to race, I'm wondering if the people who perceive themselves as more modern or more distanced from the government are perceiving Arabic as a language of contempt towards them, towards their Persianness, and if they're perceiving it as alien, and if that's part of the, I guess, cleavage within contemporary Iranian society. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Definitely. I think within the Iranian context, I think if I was Iranian, this would have been so much harder for me to think through because of all the politics that comes into what religion is and how religion is being used in a place like Iran at the current moment. And for me, I'm from Bahrain, which is a small island in between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and so the socio-political sort of situation is quite different, I think my talk is trying to take a step back from how governments like the Iranian government uses sort of this rhetoric and makes it harder for people to appreciate prayers that are beautiful by looking just at someone like my own grandmother, how she feels and speaks and uses these sort of texts. So a step beyond what is happening on the political case and how it's being used by governments or politics or the current moment, which is always changing, right? But yeah.
Thank you so much for not only a fascinating talk, but one whose compassion I think I really very much appreciate. It was a very generous presentation. I wanted to ask you a lot of things, but I'm going to focus right now just on the Ibn Qutayba bit. So one of the things that struck me about the passage that you had put up about the Nasikh and the Mansukh is that it almost seems as if in order to implement this model of Arab preference over Persians, time needs to stop, right? So the final abrogating community is actually the Arab community. This is the Nasikh, and there can be nothing else after it. So one has to also presume then that lines of communication have to be mediated to God through the material that is already present. And it struck me that when you were giving this presentation about the material that you'd gathered from your grandmother and also the Iranian reciters when going through Du'a Kumail, there's a sort of continuous relationship, right? There are other histories that open up past the idea that revelation ends in the 7th century at this particular time, and then we can't really talk about anything further. But there is a way of continuing the the relationship with God to map onto historical change. So there's a different historiographical model kind of being presented through the lives of the folks that you were talking about. So I wanted to ask you whether you see the Du'a literature, not only the present stuff that you were examining through the anthropological data, but also the medieval sources and other things aside, as sort of ways of continuing a relationship that changes with God or the heavens or the angels or something like this, as index to race, as a way of kind of incorporating other communities that might wish to continue Islamic history past a certain moment, and whether the idea of the end of history is built into the Ibn Qutayba-esque material. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Yeah, definitely, you know, and I feel like I'm thinking, as you were asking the question, I was thinking about like my translation project. And so like you have these scripts that started off as oral, right? Again, so they weren't like so static. And we have them right now in these like static manuals. It's like, this is what the Da is. And it's like surrounded by the paratext telling you how to recite it. But then you observe an actual recitation happening, and it's like the farthest from static, you know, like they're doing different things, and like just like what the reciters themselves do, you know, like it's bringing in stories, like bringing in their own like phrases from their own cultures into like it. He pauses as he's reciting the Da, he pauses, he shares something that is very Persian, like Iranian culture, and then continues, and it's so like it's a sort of speaking to, like, even, you know, like my grandmother does it. It's also, she's like, there's moments where she's like talking to Imam Hussein in the actual, you know, so like, sorry, yes, to answer your question. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. I had a question about your grandmother as a reader. So I was thinking about how, as she's speaking back to the text, even if the imam is speaking to her, she's kind of using a spoken marginalia. And so I was just wondering, have you sort of thought about her? Because I was thinking about like animate versions that happen in early texts where you have like one person writes something and then like another person will print another version of the book with like another comment underneath of it. I kept thinking of your grandmother as this reader who was like a really loving animate version who's like, oh yeah, by the way, like life moves on. You have to answer a phone. You have to do all these things. So there's just this really nice moment. And I was just wondering if you wanted to say a little bit about that.
Thank you for your question. So my grandmother didn't actually read. And so how she consumed most of these supplications was through listening, was through like every Thursday night she would go to like a place that's like a mosque called the Matam, and like people, like sometimes women would be reciting, sometimes they'd play it from like the TV or something. And so I feel like, yeah, that like just the idea of it, of how she consumed it in the first place is through people and congregation, and life is happening as you're listening. Like the listening like can stop, right? It's not like when you're sitting and just reading on your own. And so there's like interruptions that happen, and that's normal. And I remember even me like talking about this younger Iranian generation. I'm like I have those instincts too. Like I remember like once me playing her TV wasn't working, so like I played the supplication for her, and yeah, she was like listening to it, and then she started talking to me about dinner, and I'm like, in my head, I'm like, concentrate, like, why are you talking, like, listen to it, you know? And I'm like, so silly of me to like, you know, like my mode of attention of like concentration, and like, especially when it's something sacred, you think is sacred, right? Like it doesn't work for how she thinks about it or how she lives, you know, because they're always there, you know, like, so, yeah. Yeah.
I loved your opening anecdote, and I wondered what language was your grandmother using when she said, oh, she hasn't visited me in a while.
Yeah, it's a sad story. So both of my no, you're good. So my grandmother she was talking to me. So she talks to me in Arabic. And again, I say sad story because both of my parents talk in Persian, but they grew up talking to us in Arabic. And they just, I don't guess, didn't want us to get bullied at school or something for not knowing Arabic. So yeah, like even though I understand Persian, like when me and her talk, we usually talk in Arabic. And we call it in Bahrain, it sounds bad, but it's just how we call it. It's like broken Arabic. So it's like gender, like because she is a native Persian speaker, like Arabic is something that she took on later. And so like broken gender or like mixing genders and things like that. But it was in Arabic, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. This was such a beautiful talk, and I think there was just so much that was so generative and beautiful about it. Like the overlaying of your like grandmother's words and the translations and the dog mail was just so pretty and really powerful in like grounding this in like a lived experience. I hope it's okay. I'm going to offer a quick anecdote because so much of what you said related to me so much because I grew up in a Farsi-speaking mosque, and one of the things when I was a kid, in like the Quran circles, they would like the moms would constantly, the aunts would constantly, or the aunts, we called them aunts, but like the sisters would constantly ask the imam like, can we just read this in Farsi? Like, can we just read the Quran in Farsi? Because it's so hard to get the like a'udh of it. It's like, we can't get that sound out, you know? And it was always like, no, you need to read it in Arabic. Like I was always like growing up, that was always what the imam would say. And as a kid who was praying 5 times a day and like learning Arabic, there was, we started to like ask our parents, like, so does he just not hear? Like, does he just not understand if we say it in Farsi? And they were like, no, but they had to come up with all these ways. Like, it's more savab if you like say it in Arabic, you know? So there's like a power in the language itself. And my grandma learned to read just so she could read Arabic. So she's in Iran, she learned how to read, like she became literate, in quotations, so she could learn Arabic and like very much like would prefer to listen but then would constantly interrupt those du'as with like directing us to like make her a hookah, like while it's like going, you know, it was like very just like a part of the life. To live, but you know, in thinking about the 2 languages and like the lived experience of them, I'm wondering, as someone who's seen a lot of book objects as well, have you come across like, you know, medieval books where, quote medieval, like using the Western term medieval, but like of that time period where there is a more pronounced Farsi? Like at what time period do you know, like are there versions where like the Farsi is the main kind of, like even in this book, like the main language that's written and then the Arabic is the subtitle, or is that something that's very modern?
Okay, so in terms of the manuals, most of the manuals, like the older manuals were all in, a lot of them were collected by Persians too, but they were all in Arabic. There's this practice of like interlinear translation, which you see here. This is not a manuscript, but like it's the actual Arabic with like the bottom is in Persian. But then when you're reciting the Arabic, but your eyes can also see and like know what's happening. But yeah, and this is what Hari was talking about in the talk. Like it's most of the manuals, because of within the Shīʿī tradition, especially because of how much the imams have like weight and their words have weight. The scripts are kept in Arabic, even when there is interlinear translations. But there's like this sort of new movement of like literally writing the du'as in Persian, which is like what the younger generation seem to have like. At least her interlocutors, the people that she was talking to, seem to be like more into. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Rana. That was fascinating. I love the way you sort of painted a story of supplanting and abrogation as a way to explain modern racisms, and that sort of really shocking TikTok clip. And I was curious about the sort of relationship between linguistic ownership and ownership of faith and the vernacular playing out in Muslim cultures around the world that don't have the history of sort of fighting over land that you find with Persian and Arabic modern cultures. I'm thinking of sort of in Indonesia or parts of Africa. And what the sort of difference is around kind of supremacy of Arabic in faith versus the vernacular and culture, but also meeting faith and how that kind of works itself out in territories that don't have that very long and difficult history.
Yeah. So in most of these, like Indonesia, for example, most of these communities, again, there's like the Quran is recited in Arabic and the prayers are done in Arabic. And I think most of the racism comes, it's when there's Arabs involved. And so like when people like move into communities, like, you know, like, and even here, like it's a person, it's an Egyptian guy in the West, you know, diaspora himself, like going into a South Asian mosque, you know, again, there's like no fight over land, but it's just like, we are like, how you're not pronouncing it right. And this is the Quran, you should be pronouncing it better. And so we are closer to it just because, you know, we do pronounce it better. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for that fascinating talk. I was particularly interested in how you discussed ideas of language, you know, functions of language beyond cognition, and then the emphasis on love and attachment to language as one thing, but also to these, you know, more than human beings as you described. And I was, okay, I'm not going to go into this part, but I'm really curious how some of that stuff then might transfer into like academic knowledge production. This idea of like, okay, how do we have, you know, how do we challenge, you know, what are these other ways of understanding material beyond this kind of straightforward cognition? But I'm not going to ask that. I'll bother you with that later.
You tell me.
Instead, I want to go back to the idea of that tension that comes up with the idea of like what focus looks like and distraction. And, you know, like what our relationship to a particular material or language might mean, in ideas of, you know, for example, you mentioned you yourself wondering like, shouldn't you be focusing on this? Well, what are these like modes of engagement? You know, what are some roles that go beyond the idea of like this, I'm looking at like a one-to-one, everything else is closed off, versus a more permeating engagement, like what you described and illustrated, like in the WhatsApp messages and whatnot. If you could just speak a little bit more to the idea of intention versus a more permeating presence.
Yeah. I'm trying to say things that I haven't already said. But yeah, like just the thing I shared earlier about like, you know, like I think it comes down to like the intellectualizing that happens which we do because we're in academia. You know, it's like when you're looking at something, you're like, oh, what does it mean? You're trying to pull it apart, trying to like understand it. And it's very like intellectual, like cognition, intellectual. It's not bad. I'm not saying that it's bad, but I think it's like a different mode that we sometimes put higher than everything else, and other like just modes of and practices and ways of living that happen. And it becomes very easy to look at, you know, like people who aren't doing this and, you know, how they consume material and text and stuff and be like, but are you really reading it? You know? Yeah. Yeah.
I thank you for all this because it's so far from my ken, but it's exactly why I like to hear these things. And so I'm deeply interested in translation for indigenous languages and Western tradition. And one of the things that seems absent here that I'm glad to know is absent because there's a lot of racism that gets done under the banner of language and clarity and so on, was at least there's a kind of religious tradition that seems a very rich one going on in the vernacular language. Whereas a lot of the missionaries to, you know, my people, Haudenosaunee people, said the language was not capable of carrying the concepts and therefore was closed off from the gospel. And of course, the practical reaction to that is, so we have to get rid of the indigenous language. And I don't ever hear that as broad as the spread of Islam is, that it tried to get rid of Indonesian or some native language in Africa. It may claim supremacy in terms of spiritual matters and its relationship. But I can't think of, we're not allowed that difference in that the scriptures were eventually translated into Mohawk in our case, but are always considered inferior because there are certain concepts, they always say, that don't come through in the language. And I love that I see that the tension is there in what you're describing, but it's not I don't see that extinguishing quality that we experience from Christianity.
With the racism, it's trying to extinguish, right? Like, it's like this guy making fun of like South Asian actors. Like, there's this like feeling of like, we are better, speak like us, it will make you closer to like God, but there is the feeling, but it's, yeah.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.